Thank you very much. Your Eminence, Your Excellencies, Ambassador Bogai, friends, partners, and fellow students for the International Symposium on Cultural Diplomacy in the United Nations. Cultural diplomacy and the protection of religious minorities in conflict. I think some people, when they consider this topic, cultural diplomacy, in regards to protection of religious minorities, they may say, cultural diplomacy, we don't have time for that. These are urgent issues. We have to deal with protection. We have to go immediately into certain situations, intervene. We don't have time to wait for cultural diplomacy. And I wanted to explain to you just in a few sentences how I think cultural diplomacy in its newest form that we're developing also at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, how I think it can assist in the challenges of protecting religious minorities and beyond. I want to refer briefly to Archbishop Gallagher in his talk, where he said many important things, but there were two items I wanted to quote in particular. First of all, the first step that he mentioned is the need for action. We need to obviously take action in each of these situations, and I fully agree. He also quoted Pope Francis, saying, education, openness, and dialogue with others is the best solution to lasting peace, and there I also fully agree. So what is cultural diplomacy, and how might cultural diplomacy assist in such great challenges? First of all, classical cultural diplomacy, probably we're all aware of. This is this very simple idea, winning the hearts and minds of foreign audiences. As we think of the State Department, Goethe Institute, British Council, Alliance Française, many of the famous examples, that for a long time in the 20th century was cultural diplomacy. How do we attract? How do we persuade? This is something for public diplomacy, something for governments, period. You could say the Cold War was maybe one example of a great success of this soft power. Professor Joseph Nye at Harvard University always refers to the fall of the Berlin Wall as being really a success story of smart power. On the one hand, yes, there was this threat of mass destruction on either side. On the other hand, in the end, it was actually German citizens with hammers and chisels who brought this wall down. They wanted to get to the other side, either because they were disillusioned by one way, perhaps attracted by another way. There were many reasons, but they wanted to get to the other side. It wasn't missiles or guns or tanks that brought the Berlin Wall down. It was the citizens. So I think this classical form of cultural diplomacy is, of course, appropriate, and I think it can fit to certain models, certain historical contexts, but of course not all of them. The more modern form of cultural diplomacy that we're practicing and also developing at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is very simply this idea, how do we educate, enhance, and sustain relationships with the goal of building dialogue, understanding, and trust? So for us, the goal isn't any more persuasion or attraction or propaganda, as it was in many cases during the Cold War, but it's more simply this idea, let's build understanding and let's build trust. And of course, if our goal is to build trust, we need to change our approach also with cultural diplomacy. It's not enough just to send our movies abroad or send our musicians abroad, etc. We need to think seriously, how can we build trust? How can we get to know the other, whoever the other is, whether we're dealing with different religions, different cultures, different countries. So the future cultural diplomacy, or what we hope to see in situations like the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and actually all around the world, is an idea of actually taking cultural diplomacy in its classical form and turning it upside down. What I mean by that is not this idea of speaking. I want to tell you about my country, I want to tell you about my culture, I want to tell you about my religion, but actually the opposite. God gave us 2 ears, after all, and only 1 mouth. We need to do twice as much listening. So what I would propose, also from the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, what if we had a new form of cultural diplomacy focused actually on listening as opposed to speaking? Let's go and let's talk to the religious minorities. Let's talk to the religious majorities. Let's get interfaith dialogue in the fullest sense. Not just the privileged who are sitting in this room here. And when I say privileged, I mean all of us have had access to education. All of us have access to passports, have access to travel, etc. And that's a really great gift that we can't take for granted. So everyone in this room, of course, is very important. And I think we can all serve as partners and multipliers. But much more important, of course, is everyone who is not in this room. We're video recording this entire conference this week. We're putting everything on social media. We're trying our best to really get these messages out there in any way that we can, but that, of course, is the great urgency. And that would be just a few reflections on what we mean when we say cultural diplomacy, and how, in some ways, this cultural diplomacy in its newest form, this idea of listening as opposed to speaking, can really help. And practically, what do I mean by that, listening? Facebook. It's not enough just to write on Facebook. It's not enough to just send tweets. We have to also read Facebook. We have to receive tweets. We have Google Translate. Language isn't actually an issue anymore. It is possible. Movies. It's not enough to send our movies abroad. Let's look at other movies, and let's have film festivals where we can bring those films. Music. It's not enough just to send our musicians abroad. Let's bring the other musicians to us. And in this way, we can actually put our ears to the streets by really listening to local artists, empowering local artists, as opposed to just sending the best of the best from our countries abroad. So those are a few reflections on what cultural diplomacy could mean. I'd love to discuss and debate this with you later. What about religion? What about human rights? What does that have to do with culture diplomacy? As you look at the past 20th century as well, religion and human rights were almost completely absent from culture diplomacy. The idea was, oh, don't talk about those issues. Those are difficult issues. We may disagree. We may debate. Talk about art. Talk about jazz. Talk about design, the nice things. And again, it's nicer and it's easier to discuss those things. But if our goal is, in fact, to build trust, we need to, of course, discuss religion. We need to discuss human rights, not with the goal of having consensus. We don't have to agree on all of these things. I don't have to persuade you or convince you, etc. But we definitely need to listen in a humble and a respectful way to the imperfection that is our own identities, as well as the imperfection that is the other identities. And maybe we'll get closer to actually having this trust. So that's where I think religion is vitally important. And I would argue that cultural diplomacy of the future needs to include religion, issues of religious minorities, issues of religious majorities. And in terms of education, of course, that's the first step. And I think there we have to not forget the United States, the country which I'm initially from, even though we're based in Germany now, I believe it's 20, maximum 30% of Americans have passports, meaning there's a great need and urgency, I think, for the vast majority of Americans to somehow gain access and use access to travel abroad and be more exposed, not only in terms of religions, cultures, but also beyond. So to conclude, I want to come back to, again, Archbishop Gallagher. The need for action, of course, is the most urgent. I would argue that cultural diplomacy could maybe be step one, helping to prepare for that step two, the action itself. First of all, let's get the understanding, let's get the dialogue, let's get the trust and mutual respect, as Ambassador Bogai mentioned. And then if cultural diplomacy actually succeeds at that job, just bringing us to the point where we have the understanding and trust, then we can go to Archbishop Gallagher and we can really take action. Because, of course, we have to be careful when we take that action. It's the right action. In some cases, there's the risk of even doing more harm than good. And that's where I think in a humble, step-by-step way, cultural diplomacy, I think, can offer some contributions to these issues of religion and also protecting religious minorities. So thank you very much for your attention. And now I will come back to my role of listening, and I very much look forward to learning from all of you and the participants. Thank you.
Thank you.